Hello and thanks for watching this Life Solved short. I'm Robin Montague, and in these videos we get to meet the University of Portsmouth researchers who are sharing their work in the latest series of the Life Solved podcast. This is work that's changing our world for the better in all sorts of ways. With World EV Day this month, we're looking at the power behind electric vehicles, the batteries themselves. And as most of us consider ditching our petrol cars in favour of ones we simply plug in, we're going to explore both the positives and the negatives, and the charges for and against this developing technology. I'm joined by Professor Jamie Foster, Reader in Applied and Industrial Mathematics here at the university, to find out what the battery-powered future holds for us all. Jamie, thank you very much for joining me. So let's crack on then. We're used to batteries in our lives. I mean, I've got one literally in my pocket right now. Whether they're powering a torch, a phone, a car, we're all fairly familiar with the term batteries, but I'm not going to lie, I'm not 100% confident on what a battery actually is and how it functions. Clearly wasn't paying attention in my science lessons. So can you just kick us off by explaining what it is? What is a battery?
Yeah. Okay, so the very, very basic answer is it's a way of storing electrical energy. And there's a variety of different batteries out there. So lithium ion is like the one that I work on primarily. It's the one that's the kind of leading candidate for going in EVs. But there are a variety of other types of battery. Maybe we'll touch upon them later. And so the very fundamental components of a battery are its electrodes. So in any battery, you have two of these electrodes. One's called an anode and the other one's called a cathode. Some people call them negative and positive, but I'll say anode and cathode. And this is true independent of the format of the battery. So you might, if you think of the batteries you might put in your TV remote, they're like cylindrical ones. So they're anodes and cathodes rolled up like a Swiss roll. Other batteries, so the ones that go in your laptop, they're called pouch cells. They're like cuboids instead of cylinders. So they're anodes and cathodes layered like a pastry kind of thing. So in the two electrodes, the anode and the cathode, you have lithium. So that's where the lithium-ion battery gets its name. And what happens is the lithium moves backwards and forwards between the two electrodes. So when you charge the battery, the lithium goes from the cathode into the anode, and when you discharge, it goes the other way, so from the anode into the cathode. And the reason you can store energy this way is because, so to use posh words, the lithium has a kind of electrochemical affinity for the cathode. So in slightly plainer terms, the lithium likes to be in the cathode rather than the anode. So when you charge the battery, you have to kind of encourage the lithium by doing some work on it to go from the cathode into the anode. And then you unplug the battery and now all your lithium's sitting in the anode. And then when you plug it back in to use the power, the lithium says, oh good, I can now run back into the cathode, and it releases its energy when it does that. So I think a good kind of picture to have in your head is if you imagine the lithium as a load of little footballs. Imagine there's a big hill. A load of little footballs are at the bottom. So the bottom of the hill is the cathode in this analogy. And at the top of the hill, there's a little enclosure where you can put the lithium. So when you charge the battery, you're doing the work of lifting all the little footballs to the top of the hill, putting them in their little enclosure. And then when you want to get the energy back out, you just open the enclosure and they will happily roll back down to the bottom of the hill, releasing the energy.
That's actually a Taskmaster challenge. If anyone's seen Taskmaster, there is actually genuinely a challenge where they're rolling balls up a hill and then trying to stop them from falling down again. Maybe that's where they got the concept from. So obviously batteries to me sounds like energy type medium or area for research.
Yep.
But your expertise, as we found out in the introduction, is mathematics.
Yeah.
So where does the maths come into this whole process?
When you're trying to make devices better, there's different ways of going about it. So one way of doing it is to do a kind of shake and bake approach. So what I mean by that is you just build many, many different sorts of battery you test all of them and you see which one works the best. So that's a rather blunt way of doing it. And it's not ideal because it costs money to build all these different batteries. It takes a long time. Testing can be expensive. So a different way of going about it is to write down what are called mathematical models for batteries. So a mathematical model is a kind of a virtual battery, if you like. So you write down some equations, so some mathematics to describe what's going on in the battery. And of course you have to validate and test these models, but once you've got models that are predictive and validated and you're kind of confident in what they're doing, you can then use the models to test out different batteries without ever building them. So you say, you tell your model, oh, if I tweak this parameter, this aspect of the design, how will that change the performance of the battery? And then you might have to run some computer programs, or you might have to run some code or do some thinking about the mathematics, but the maths, once validated, tells you which battery design is best. So it saves you a lot of time and money if you can write down a good mathematical model.
Which you can.
Yeah,
Proof of concept.
we try, yeah.
It reminds me a bit of a film I watched about the women who were helping to get men to the moon, part of the NASA space mission, and they were doing all the maths around that.
Exactly, yeah.
It's fascinating.
So
how much...
before any of those rockets ever got shot into the sky, I'm sure somebody worked out, wrote some equations down. Here's our best guess at where this is going to go. Here's where you want to point it. Here's how much fuel you want to put in it.
And we're talking specifically on this episode about electric vehicles, or EVs, as people like to call them. And they're often being pushed on customers, including myself. I'm looking to buy a new car, partly down because of improved efficiency and also the size of the batteries now, because it wasn't really, go back a few decades or a few years ago, it just wasn't plausible to have a car battery really that looked good and could work in a car vehicle or a model.
Yeah. Yes, true. So batteries have been around a while, but as you say, the challenge is making them small enough and energy dense enough that you can stick it in a car and actually drive a useful distance. So yeah, there's decades of innovation and work behind making these lithium batteries small enough that they can fit in cars and energy dense enough that you can drive at least 100 miles or more. Even though they're starting to appear in cars, like you can go downstairs and you can see people driving around in EVs, there's still a lot of room for improvement, let's say. So people hesitate to buy electric vehicles usually for a few reasons. So one is that even though you can go a reasonable distance now, maybe you'd like to go a bit further. It's still probably not possible to drive from here to Edinburgh and back, say, on a single charge. Another thing that makes people hesitate a bit is that there's a lifetime on these batteries. So, different manufacturers quote for different numbers of cycles and different numbers of miles that you can drive your EV, but those numbers are not as big as people want them to be. So people hesitate because a really large fraction of the cost of an EV is the battery. So I'm painting with broad strokes here, but roughly speaking, you could say about half of the cost of the EV is in the battery. So it's a big deal. If the battery fails, that's a big deal. It's a big investment. So people want them to last a while. And then the other big problem is you want to be able to refuel it quickly. So if you do want to drive to Edinburgh and back, you might have to recharge several times. And if you can pull into the electric equivalent of a filling station and be recharged in a couple of minutes like you can with a combustion engine, it's not a big deal to have to recharge. But if you have to plug in and wait 2 hours or more every time you want to charge it up, then that is a big deal. So yeah, I would say more energy density we would really like, longer lifetime of batteries we would really like, and faster charging we would really like. So these are the three pillars that people are nibbling away at now. Yeah.
Pillars of EV. And when you say energy dense,
Yeah.
what does that actually mean? How can we unpick that phrase?
So you can measure it a couple of different ways. So it's the amount of energy you can get either per weight or per volume. So so the reason energy is the thing I'm talking about is more energy means you can drive further. So what you really want is lots of energy in a small space. That's high energy density, or you want lots of energy at light weight. So that's energy dense as well, measured slightly different ways. And so they're measured in these two different ways because depending on the application, you might care more about energy density by weight or by volume. So just to give you an example of that, if you're building a flying electric vehicle, like a drone, say, so not an electric car, but a drone for doing surveillance or something like that, what you really care about is how much energy you can get per kilo, because you've got to lift all that weight off the ground on your drone. But if you're size restricted, so maybe you want to build a robot for crawling into small spaces or something, maybe you care about how much energy you can get per volume instead of per weight.
It does amaze me though how much the technology has evolved fairly recently as well. Batteries when I was younger were a lot bigger, especially when you had things in the home and we had to have a battery with it. And then now you can get batteries, tiny little batteries in your phone, or even, like you said, in other devices. It's just how much smaller can we get if we're still aiming for that much energy density?
There's a kind of theoretical limit on how small you can make these, and over the last few decades of innovation, we've come a lot closer to that limit than where we started at. So certainly there's a law of diminishing returns, and there will come a point where they're so small that maybe it will be more appealing to move to a different technology altogether. So move away from lithium to something different.
And lithium as well, obviously, not just a size issue, it's finite. So
the chemical itself,
yeah, the chemical itself. So being able to mass produce batteries using lithium, it's not forever. We can't continue in that way.
It's true. Yeah. So so in lithium batteries, there's other chemicals that are often used which are not so abundant. So cobalt is one, nickel is another one, and as you say, they're scarce. They're not available everywhere in the world evenly. So there's certain places where they're typically mined quite intensively, and there's ethical issues around that and environmental issues around that, which are a problem. Like, they need to be discussed about and thought about as well. Yeah, the fact that lithium isn't so abundant does motivate looking for technologies that make use of chemicals and elements that are all around us. So sodium, part of the reason that people are getting excited about sodium-ion batteries recently is because they get around that issue. So sodium is a lot easier to get hold of than lithium. You can get it out of the sea, for example. So a lot more abundant. I think an important thing to say in relation to the point you made about lithium being finite and quite scarce is there's a lot of thought that goes into recycling batteries, how you can do that cleanly, how you can give batteries what's called second life. So have some colleagues who I work with who think about this a lot, and so putting a lithium battery in an electric vehicle is quite a demanding thing to do. So you need a good, new, healthy battery in order to drive an EV. So one thing that people do is think about, when the battery's no longer good enough to work in an electric vehicle, can I repurpose it for something else? So kind of, second life, or like upcycling the battery, if you like. So once a battery's no longer fit and healthy enough to drive the car around, you might think about using it for off-grid storage or something like that. So you can, where charging rates and discharging rates are lower, the battery will still work.
Again, growing up, mention Top Gear, the mention of an EV car was just a laughing stock, wasn't it? No one really took it very seriously. The cars weren't very nice to look at. So what's changed? Why have we all suddenly just decided that actually EVs are potentially the way forward?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's not to be too doom and gloom, but I mean, climate change is like it's an existential threat. Like it's a serious problem, and EVs are a big part of the steps we can take towards mitigating climate change. So I don't want to overstate it and say, if we can sort these batteries out, we can get everyone an EV, climate change won't be a problem anymore. It's not. It's only a part of the solution, but it's an important part of the solution. So I think, yeah, just to answer the question, like the reason attitudes have shifted towards them is people have kind of, woken up to the fact that as a society we need to do something about the climate crisis.
And it is important to note, though, I think a lot of people confuse EV as completely green or fully sustainable, but it's not, is it?
Yeah, as you say, not entirely green. So we kind of touched upon this already, but there's issues down the food chain to do with where do the chemicals that go into the batteries come from in the first place. Like they need to be sourced in a responsible way. We need to be responsible about what we do with the batteries after they've served their lifetime. So we need to dispose of them or ideally recycle them responsibly. And then the other thing that people can miss often is the fact that so the battery, even if it's the perfect battery, all it's doing is storing the energy. So the other big piece of the puzzle is how do you generate the energy in the first place? And that's a whole different discussion, and I've got some thoughts about that as well. So I've done a little bit of work on solar cells, my other research, but yeah, the point is you need to generate the energy in a green way in the first place, and that might be through solar, through wind, tidal, and then you put it in the batteries and then you use it. So they're only even part of the solution to the green problem, but they are a big part. And I don't want anyone to take what I've just said as, oh, never mind, I'll just keep driving my petrol car, my diesel car. Then that's not the message I'm trying to give here. It's just that
it's not.
There's more work to do, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, remember that. And on this topic of climate change, if you are enjoying this episode, why not check out another episode that we've recorded with Dr. Chris Jones, and it's the power of public perception in the fight against climate change. So Chris unpacks how people's attitudes are sometimes just as important as technology and policy when it comes to making greener choices stick. You can just search for this episode wherever you listen to podcasts under Life Solved. So we touched on it briefly a minute ago, but the more you recharge your phone, I'm using a phone because everyone's got a phone probably, or your laptop or your car, the more worn out the battery gets. My phone's already playing up, and I think it's now a 1.5 years old. And this is all down to degradation. So what is degradation in a technical term, and why is it an issue? Yeah,
so degradation, it just means the battery health decreasing. And there's a number of different forms of degradation. There's a number of different kind of manifestations of it. So when you say your phone's playing up, I imagine what you're talking about is, when you first bought it, maybe you could be yakking on the phone, taking photos all day, and it would be fine. But now maybe you have to top up the battery at lunchtime. So its capacity or its energy gets used up more quickly. So one form of degradation is capacity fade, which would be what I'm talking about there. And there can be multiple reasons for that. So there are chemical reasons for it. So just to go back to my colourful picture about footballs going up and down hills. So those lithium atoms, the footballs in the analogy, over time those footballs can, maybe they get lost, they roll off, in the analogy, that's they get caught up in some chemical junk that's in the battery, and they get tied up, and you can't use them anymore. Or maybe the hill that you're pushing the batteries up and down, there's a load of ruts in it, and it's now harder work to push the footballs up and down. So the system just gets less pristine over time.
Is there anything else, just to end, is there anything else that's happening in the industry that you find quite interesting when it comes to EV?
Wellity.
Never heard anyone say duality.
I suggest editing that out. So
no, that's
nobody
going
else
on. That's going on the social media pages.
If you're a person like me who wants to understand what's happening inside a battery, and you want to understand, say, a commercial battery from some manufacturer, you have to buy the battery, tear it apart, do all sorts of expensive, time-consuming experiments on it in order to figure out what's even in it. So, yeah, there's this thing, battery parameter exchange, and the idea there is to kind of break down some of the barriers to do with sharing information about what's in batteries and how you can simulate them. So I think that's quite exciting to me, because it's a kind of freedom of information. It's empowering people to basically, as a society, design better batteries. So I think that's exciting and something I'm looking forward to seeing happen.
Sharing's caring.
Sharing's caring.
Well, thank you, Jamie, so much. It was really interesting chatting to you today. And battery technology has developed hugely over the last decade or so, with more efficient, faster charging and smaller cells. But the push continues for improvements, meaning there is some way to go before we see the ultimate green, fast-charging, long-distance electric vehicle of our dreams. Fingers crossed, it's sooner rather than later. If you'd like to listen to our full episode of Life Solved, discussing the growth in EV technology and all of the little bits about it, then please head to the University of Portsmouth website or download it onto your favourite podcast app now. You can also click the link in the comments box below or head to port.ac.uk/research to find out more about Jamie's research into EVs and the batteries they contain. Next time, the history of the weekend and why 2 days a week might not be enough. See you then.